In English lore, when King Arthur brought the Knights of Camelot together to pursue prosperity, it was at a round table, a meeting of equals. Instead of relegating anyone to isolation or condemning them to act out in anger, King Arthur recognized that only through a meeting of balanced powers could true success be achieved. Now, might may not be right, but it could be used as a vehicle for right. Now, we're proud to propose this motion because we believe in supporting China, not shunning their progress. But first, for some definitions. This House is going to be defined as the international community. Supports will be defined as agreeing with or approving of China's rise, and the rise of China will be the period of China's history beginning with Deng Xiaoping's open door policy, starting in 1979 when China renounced its isolation. But most importantly, the course of today's debate is to establish a framework, because it's single-handedly what's going to determine the burden of both the proposition and the opposition. What's important to remember is that 45 million people died of starvation under Mao Zedong. The rise of China stopped that. So the question that we have to ask is whether the rise of China is better than the absence of the rise of China at all. Would life or the greater international community be better under Mao Zedong's rule, pre-1979 and Deng Xiaoping? Or would it be better under a modern world or a modern China, in which families are being pulled out of poverty? Now, the proposition concedes that the rise of China has not been perfect, but no rise of any nation has ever been perfect. We have to evaluate the utilitarian benefit of the rise of China, and what we find is that the imperfections are outweighed by the benefits. But first, the rise of China is the rise of an economic powerhouse. So let's talk about their economic empowerment. First, let's acknowledge what happened under Mao Zedong, and second, let's acknowledge what happened under the rise of China post-Deng Xiaoping's liberalization policies. Under Mao Zedong, in the period of European colonialism, the average worker made about $4,900. But fast forward under Deng Xiaoping and his liberalization policies, the average worker's income nearly doubled to $9,000. Once again, let's go back to Mao Zedong's time. Under Mao Zedong, 45 million people died of starvation because they did not have the money to purchase food. But according to an Economist report, 680 million people were pulled out of poverty because of China's economic rise since Deng Xiaoping. Under Deng Xiaoping and the rise of China, famished families were finally able to provide food for their loved ones. People who were originally on death's doorstep now have a doorstep leading to their own homes with their own roofs over their own heads. Compare that to the absence of the rise of China, and you find 45 million people dead, incomes leading more families homeless than housed. There is no way that the opposition can morally say that this would be preferable to no rise at all. But next, it's important to acknowledge the principle of multipolarity, when more than 4 nations can get together at a roundtable discussion to discuss possible international solutions to international problems. Western nations have been taking the head of pressing international issues, but we need to get a diversity in discourse, a difference in major viewpoints, because no singular hemisphere or country should be dictating major global policies with major global ramifications. For example, the United States in the status quo basically solely dictates Middle Eastern policies. Back in the past, we found that the United States basically solely dictated Russia's policies in the Cold War. But just 2 days ago, the United States recognized China as a bigger part of both the IMF and the World Trade Organization, both of which increased both organizations' legitimacy and gave more representation to China at roundtable discussions. As a result of this, we found that the impact was a stabilized Chinese economy, increased purchasing power of Chinese as well as international individuals, in keeping domestic and international prices fair, and keeping interest rates and inflation rates at a constant level to avoid fluctuations. Without the rise of China, the position that the opposition would have to stand for, we would be seeing a few unipolar Western actors dictating policies. With an absence of the rise of China, China would have stayed isolationist, continued its economic destructions internally and externally, and we would have had no multipolarity in our international talks. But lastly, for our talk about economic empowerment, it's important to establish the impact of a growing middle class. By 2030, it's projected that China's middle class will take up 93% of the urban population. So 326 million new individuals will emerge in the middle class. This means that people are coming out of abject poverty, without which millions would be struggling to find food or shelter. Moreover, these individuals now have more power to consume. Consumption share in the GDP is expected to rise by around 50% in 2030 and 36% by 2014. what we find is that when you increase the purchasing power of individuals, when you make them more economically viable, not only are we going to be increasing the power of China as a nation, but we're going to be making it better on an individual level, in a microcosm, but also on a macro level when we talk about the ramifications, and my second point, to the rest of the world. It's important to also acknowledge the rise of political progress, and that's our second major contention. What we want to concede is that China acknowledges its own faults. When we talk about the rise of China, we know that it has not risen without its mistakes. But again, neither has any other nation. But what's important to acknowledge is that without the rise, they never would have been able to fix their mistakes in the past. For example, China ended their one-child policy. But it's also important to acknowledge that that one-child policy started because when 45 million people were dying of starvation in China, China reached out to the international community. But the international community, this House in the course of today's debate, turned their backs, said that they would not support China. That's exactly what led China to make the mistake in the first place. But now that China has risen, it's going to use its power and its might to correct its wrongs that it's made in the past. That wouldn't have been able to happen had China not risen out of its state of poverty, its state of starvation. Moreover, we're talking about political progress when we talk about its heating of political corruption. 106,000 officials have been charged with political corruption. What this means is that we're catching both the tigers and the flies. The big criminals, the biggest culprits of political corruption, as well as the smallest ones on local, state, and municipal levels. Because we're seeing a decrease in political corruption, that's happening through the direct change or the direct rise of China. That's something that the international community has to support because the fewer politically corrupt politicians that the international community is dealing with, the greater our diplomatic ties. Not only are we giving more political agency to different individuals within the status quo within China, but we're also making diplomatic talks more feasible. Also, the Communist Party wants to modernize, meaning that they're going to make themselves less bureaucratic. They're going to make stronger laws and give more political agency on an individual level. But for our last major subpoint, on the point of political progress, it's important to acknowledge that how we're now going to be supporting the international community when we support the rise of China. That's best seen through the example of Africa. China is the greatest investor in African countries, stimulating hundreds of millions of dollars in economic growth in nations like Sudan, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and the Sahel. China's investing in things that are ubiquitously good. For example, they single-handedly established Kenya's power infrastructure, which gave energy to over 2 million people in the course of 5 years. They established India's environmental protection programs, and they're supporting the Sahel region of Africa's enormous end to African deforestation and desertification of deserts and forests. China's rise has facilitated the rise of other nations. It's using its economic and political power to somehow prop up other nations. Now that's something that the international community has stand for. That's something that the proposition stand for, and we beg you to do the same. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we approve of the definition given by side proposition. In their speech, they've talked about the economic empowerment and that families won't be starving anymore as China gave them the help to get out of starvation. And therefore, I'm sorry. And China has stopped the starvation because apparently life is better. It is better to have it is better to have the help out of starvation, no matter how it is made and how the nation helps to get out of the starvation. But this is not true, as China is a really big country and has much power in the whole world. It has to be a role model for other countries as well. So China has to do the right moral things and has to do it correctly to show other countries how to react. And because China has such a massive power, it's important that they do it correctly. And because of the economic goods for China, there is a middle class, and there's been a huge digital dividing, so it is better on the individual level. And politically, politicians can be corrupted and corruptive, so they can be corruptive and do it for their own good and for the country's good and not for the world's good. And if there's no leverage, and establishing countries in Africa would be very selfish. So let me come to my speech now. We as side opposition have the task to raise serious doubts as to the positive impact of the rise of China, and we have to show that in the short and long run, the rise of China to political, economic and military power has tangible harms for all the parties involved, and we will do this under the team line that the rise of China causes more harms and it outweighs the benefits. I, as a first speaker, will focus on two aspects. Firstly, that the rise of China poses a serious threat to security and stability in Eastern Asia, the world and freedom of the individual. And secondly, the rapid rise to economic power poses a serious threat to the environment. Our second speaker will focus on the negative effects which China's rise to economic power has on developing countries. Now let me come to my first argument. The developments in the last 10 years have clearly shown that as a result of the rise to political and military power, the country has tried to maximize its powers in East Asia, establish a sphere of influence and protect the economic and military interests by intimidating other countries. No, thank you. By the use of force. However, there have been high-level meetings between the leaders of China, Japan and Taiwan recently. The political and military situation remains really tense. For example, there are China's missile tests in the East China Sea in 2010, were a clear warning to Taiwan, because as China would not accept the foundation of an independent Taiwan, and China's gunboat publicity in East China and the South China Sea also illustrate that China... Yes, please.
Isn't all of this outweighed by the 680 million lives that China has brought out of poverty?
No, this is not true. It is not outweighed, because this is still really important, and China has massive powers, as I've said before, and therefore it is dangerous for the nations, and because this could lead to further problematic problems, and therefore it is important that there are missile tests and China's gun publicity, and it is a threat to other nations and the country, as they pressurize Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam and the Philippines to accept the Chinese claim of sovereignty over small islands. For example, the Senkaku Islands, because they have all oil and gas resources, and they will be found there, and China needs this to power their economic growth with.
Ma'am?
No, thank you. And because of China's military build-up and the aggressive policies in East Asia, the regional stability and the international stability are at stake. For the US, East Asia is extremely important as far as political and economic interests are concerned, and as a result of the aggressive political tensions between the US and China, which have increased.
Point of information?
No, thank you. The US is obliged to support its partners in the region, and they feel threatened by China. It's because should these tensions escalate, the security and stability in East Asia and the world will be at stake.
Ma'am?
No, thank you. And now let me come to the individual harm caused by the rise of China. China's rise to power has contributed to stabilizing the political system based on oppression, the denial of human rights, and the denial of human rights to the Chinese population. The oppressive framework causes human suffering for hundreds of thousands of people and families who want to exercise the human rights laid down in the UN Charter of Human Rights. The result of the rise of China and its economic importance of the nations have no leverage on the development in China, and therefore the governments do not dare to do anything about it because they are afraid of losing segments in the market of China. And this lack of leverage contributes to stabilizing the oppressive system in China. And it has become a model for many countries, for example Sudan or Angola, which are the most loyal partners in Africa of China, and there are similar autocratic systems, and they deny the human basic rights. And let me come to the environmental harm. Chinese rise to economic power is driven by fossil fuels for decades. They have begun to build hydroelectric power stations and wind farms, but fossil fuels will remain the major energy source for many years to come. And there is a rising number of cars with combustion engines. It has exacerbated the problem, and they don't meet the European and American standard. So there's air pollution, and it has become a serious problem as the cities are choked by smog.
I want you to step back for a moment and imagine two rooms. In one room, you have a starving man without enough food on the table, and his family watching him starve to death. That multiplied by 45 million people. And then in the other room, you have a homeless man accepting a job that was created for him by the factories that are now happening in the rising industrialized China, and multiply that by 680 million people. That is the stakes of this debate. We're not playing around when we say that the rise of China has done more good than harm. We're telling you that not only does it mean that 45 million people don't die the worst death that a human could possibly die, a slow death of starvation, but that beyond that, people are getting jobs, people are allowed food on the table, that the middle class in China is rising, and that along with it, human rights are rising as well. That is why we win this debate. Let's first deconstruct the opposition's case before we go on into our own points. So, on their first point, which is about them being oppressive in their region, a few different answers. First of all, as China has needed to become more globalized to gain global influences, it's needed to stop its oppression, not keep it going. Remember that this debate is about a constant rise into comparative, that we don't have to compare like what China did many years ago with what it does right now, and that what it does right now should be evaluated in the context of what is happening in terms of rises and changes in a changing China. That the problems in the Senkaku Islands recently, although tense, have not created actual human rights abuses. People are not actually dying. And that is because of a globalized China that's wanted to increase its international influence in places like the UN and IMF. And that is part of the rise, which is why they're not contributing to human rights abuses there, in an area that has been tense for basically a century. But before I move on.
Okay, so you really think that in order to be considered a human right abuse, you have to have the person dying, firstly. And secondly, what about in Sudan? What about in Angola when they have accepted these regimes and are committing so many human rights?
Okay, so I'm going to answer the first one of those because I don't want to answer two POIs. The first one was, you really think death constitutes the only human rights abuse? No. Just not like China hasn't been doing anything in the Senkaku Islands. That's all I'm saying. The second response to this is that China balances the rest of the world. That, you know, like we can't have the United States be a multipolar regime and basically do whatever it wants, to be the only influence in really deciding what NATO does, to be the primary influence in deciding what the United Nations does regardless of the Security Council. That we should have other powers in the world that get to contest the United States hegemony in order to make sure things like Middle Eastern intervention don't happen. Our third argument is that stability in Asia is not actually being threatened. So for example, China does things like implement the Asian Infrastructure Bank inside Asia, which contributes to the long-term health of basically all Asian states as they've joined, for example, like ASEAN, which is something that China has wholeheartedly supported. Stability in the region is actually increasing based on active efforts that China makes in a far more constructive way than simply like a set of islands in like the Western Pacific. But let's move on to their second argument, which is about human rights abuses. Remember that this is a comparative debate. So we are talking about like what happened before the rise of China and what is happening now in the rise of China. So we can't evaluate these human rights abuses just in their own right. We have to remember that before the rise of China, 45 million people were dying of starvation. That's a human rights abuse that you can just not account for on your side. Remember, we're talking on the scale, the team proposition is talking on the scale of millions of people and the impact of those people being life or death. The arguments that they're talking about just pale in comparison. Until they start talking on that level, they just will never win this round. Moving on to our arguments. Our first argument is about economic growth. We told you 45 million people dead before, 680 million people risen out of poverty now. And that the rise of China is directly responsible for that from a political perspective as well. That because people in China can own property now, because they've implemented liberal economic policies now, because of the death of Maoism now, because they can create a stable economy for their people, that is what's creating the loss of starvation and the increase in jobs. That in the future, China will be stable, that they joined the IMF, that they are the largest contributor to it, that they are stabilizing their international currency, that they are increasing multipolarity, that 320 million more people in the next 10 years are going to be risen out of poverty because of this. So this is an impact that you can look forward to because the rise of China has been so good on the economic level. And for each of those millions of people, it matters more than any argument that the other side has made. The second argument that we're making is about an increase in political progress. We say, yes, there are mistakes, but corruption is decreasing. For example, China has recently taken out their Secretary of War and one of their major generals because of corruption. That foreign aid to Africa, many countries in Africa, for example, Nigeria, are key to those countries being developed. So for example, the reason why Nigeria is soon to become the third largest economy in the world is largely because China has invested unconditional foreign aid in their economy that allows businesses to grow at a rate that is unparalleled anywhere in Africa, specifically in Nigeria. That has allowed that country to, again, experience a similar rise out of poverty that China did, on the order of millions. So we're talking about political ramifications here that spread far beyond China. Even in Sudan, unconditional aid to businesses can create social change. Moving on to our third argument, that the rise of China is the rise of social liberation. Remember again, the context of this debate, that we're talking about a comparative. The comparative of the before aspect is that during Mao's regime, they were killing artists for expressing their opinions. They were conducting routine inspections of women to ensure that they were virgins before they were married. They were killing and raping the old landlord class. Again, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in China. That they were killing millions of ethnic minorities simply because they did not conform to the communist ideal of their society. And all of that changed when the rise of China happened. When Deng Xiaoping came into power, he allowed people to do things like own property. He stopped the government from killing people actively. The most important thing that he did was he allowed people to believe that they could work for themselves, that they could better their own situations, that it wasn't just they had to be an object for their own government. And that's what led to magnificent change in China. That's what led, for example, for 1982, the Constitution of China was rewritten to include things like freedom of speech. And although the ramifications of that were not necessarily felt immediately, in the 2008 Beijing Olympics, China, for the first time, allowed people to publicly protest on the international stage. That's something that has never happened before in the history of China, and it is because of the rise. And the black jails, which are containing political dissidents, are like of 80% lower capacity than they were before, which means they're cracking down significantly less. There's a bunch of different ways in which the rise affects this social change. The stop of the one-child policy, possibly the most destructive policy in China's history, the increase of feminism in China, the stopping of labor camps in China. All of this is because of the rise of China, and yes, there are challenges still, but compared to before, millions of people's lives are better. Imagine that you're one of these women who had to routinely get their virginity checked by some government official male, essentially getting sexually harassed and or raped. For that person, the rise of China has done more good than harm. And for the 680 million people brought out of poverty, China has definitely done more good than harm. Thank you.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome from side opposition. Before I come to my rebuttal speech, let me clarify what Team Opposition stands for in this debate. We firmly believe that the harm caused by China's rise to political, economical and military power outweighs the benefits caused by it. We believe that the international community, individual countries, including China, and the individual are confronted serious disadvantages caused by the rise of China. Now let me come to their arguments. They've presented 5 major arguments. Let me deal with them one by one. They've compared the situation from Mao with today. We can compare it actually. They said, no, we can't compare it because it was before. But we can say that when people starve to death and when we intimidate Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands, we more or less say that we more or less willingly kill people by this. So there's no actual difference between the new China and the old China.
Sir, point of information.
No, thank you. The second argument was about the rise of Nigeria. Nigeria's rise, or Sudan's rise, or Angola's rise, whatever. They are supporting regimes that disrespect human rights. And they're saying in their speeches... Yes, please.
I'm sorry, but not all African countries disrespect human rights. Nigeria has actually a pretty good human rights record on behalf of its government.
I agree. But Angola disrespects human rights. Sudan disrespects human rights. We have civil wars in Sudan and Angola.
Point.
Yes, please.
There's civil wars in China. That doesn't necessarily mean that we don't support it.
Where do we have civil wars in China?
Just, I mean...
May I respond?
No.
I don't think we have civil wars in China. I've never heard of it before. Since Mao, there's never been a war ever in China before. When we support Angola, we disrespect human rights. Because they disrespect human rights. We legitimize a system there which disrespects human rights. Therefore, their point falls. And secondly, they talked about that nowadays artists and other people are respected and given an open ear to. Let me remind you of the example of Ai Weiwei. What was he done to? He was sentenced to prison for publishing art which is criticising the Chinese regime. I don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that this is respecting human rights and freedom of opinion. No, thank you. Secondly, they give the example of Beijing as the Olympic Games. But this is against human rights violation because they just killed loads of walkabout building that gigantic stadium without, casual death, no problem with them. Is that basic human, is that natural to do that? I don't think so, no thank you. Then, they talked about the one-child policy, which is indeed, as I agree with them, the most harmful policy that I've ever had in China. But this belongs to the new China and not to the old China, and they were talking about that the new China is far better than the old China. But the new China indeed is not better, as I told you in my before. Now let me come to my substantive speech.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Firstly, I'll show you that China's thirst for raw materials, which has made China rise possible, many African countries have to suffer. Secondly, China's rise to economic power and the links, which links to our first speaker, is based on a massive motivation of energy and China's and mineral resources. As China's resources are limited, for example, it's estimated China's oil resources will be run out by 2023.
Point of information.
Yes, please.
China recently launched the largest initiative for alternative energy in human history.
Still, they're exploiting, and still they're the biggest gas producers, the biggest coal consumers, the biggest gas consumers. How is that in relation to having a large alternative energy project? I don't understand this point, ladies and gentlemen. So, they have been developing in Africa for many of years. The excess raw materials there. For example, in Sudan, Angola, Congo, Equatorial Guinea or Nigeria are beneficial to China because the raw materials from these countries, for example, oil, timber, copper, zinc and rare earth powers, China's economy, are contributing to China's growth. But these partnerships are detrimental to sustainable economy which disrespects the environment and social development in Africa's countries. Why is this the case?
Point of information.
No, thank you. Firstly, the vast majority of the Chinese FDI, which is the foreign direct investment, inflows to Africa over the past decade has been concentrated in extractive industry, which require a large amount of capital investment in equipment. Equipment produced creates very limited domestic growth because China provides the equipment that is needed for the mining industries. The effect on the job market is also very limited. On the one hand, most of the highly skilled staff are from China, and on the other hand, open cast mining and handling of raw materials are often highly automated, so that they don't supply the country where they're built
Point of
off.
information.
No, thank you. And secondly, they're not really helping them because they take their own stuff from China. They're not helping at all. They don't employ Africans to do these jobs. They take their own Chinese workers.
Sir.
No, thank you. Secondly, 90% of the raw materials are extracted in, as I said, in Sudan, Angola and Congo, are exported to China. In China, they build other parts. These parts are put together somewhere and sold back in African countries. So, they're profiting twice. They're already taking money in and they're mining the raw materials for themselves. No, thank you. And then selling the products made by these raw materials there, destroying the market there. It is true that as a result of African-Chinese partnerships, African countries get access to the Chinese market, but the problem is that these products are not really competitive on the Chinese market. But what is worse for African economies is that manufactured goods, as I already said, are high-quality technical products and luxury goods made in China have flooded the markets. So Africa they're not sustainable. They don't actually help Africa to any beneficial things. They don't help at all. So what have I shown you today? I've shown you that China is absolutely economically unsustainable, and twice that they're destroying the African market by over-flooding it with their own products. Secondly, exploiting the African mines. And thirdly, side proposition is sticking to old history and things that are not in relation to anything. Therefore, I beg to oppose.
Look, Nick told you to imagine two worlds. He told you to imagine a world in which 45 million people were killed. And then he told you to imagine another world. And this world is not perfect. Side proposition has agreed. But it is comparatively a little bit better than the world before. In a world in which 680 million people are out of poverty. In a world in which women do not have to be raped to wonder if they're virgins or not. In a world in which there are people who are able to express themselves artistically. We think this is the framing issue for the round. This is how you should evaluate it. Side opposition has agreed that they have to defend post-rise of China. All we have to show is that the rise of China comparatively is better than before. They gave a lot of reasons why it's bad. We agree, some parts are not perfect. But comparatively, if it is somewhat better, if some people are saved post-rise of China, then that's why side proposition is winning this debate. I'm going to be doing three things in this speech. First, I'm going to be going over the framing issue. Second, I'm going to be going over the third point about the environment. And finally, I'll be asking 3 points of clash, which are, is the rise of China beneficial to the economy? Second, can the rise of China make the world more global and diplomatic? And third, does China have more social benefits after the rise than before the rise? But first, the model debate. We have agreed that this house is the international community, which means you should frame your ballot in a context of, if you are the international community, do you evaluate the rise of China being more diplomatic, being more global, being more multipolar? Without the rise of China, we have a unipolar Western nation in which America and Europe make all the decisions. We think allowing China to be in the diplomatic regime of making discussions and actually having decisions is uniquely good. It's beneficial to all parties. Second, We think that the concept of before versus after is important. They've given reasons why China is bad, and we've understood that all Western regimes that have risen to power are not perfect, but comparatively is better. And finally, I want to talk about what Julia said when she talked about civil war. She did not mean a literal civil war, she simply meant there are human rights abuses. Yes, there are human rights abuses in China, just like the Tiananmen protests of 1989. We acknowledge that, but nothing is perfect. And if you have to ask yourself a question, what is the alternative inside opposition? 45 million people died, women raped, culture not allowed. That's the alternative. We think comparatively we're better. So let's go to the third point about the environment. First of all, this is not unique. December 5th in Paris, every major global hegemon went to a nation to talk about climate change. China was one of the major contributors in talking about how they could stop their pollution in their country. They said instead of running coal, they're going to invest more energy into solar power, which is really good. They've also said that because they're going to invest into solar power, they're going to be multipolar. We see multipolarity happening because China is attending these conferences. You know why China wants to come to these conferences? Because of the rise of China. 40 years ago, China would have never came to Paris to talk about climate change because it wasn't even considered an actual nation that could stand on its own. Because China recognizes that they have problems within the climate, because China recognizes that there's pollution, they willingly came to Paris to talk about it. And I think that's the most we could ask out of a nation. What can you do to be better? If China is investing in more energy and becoming better, we think it's a good thing.
On that point.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, but this treaty is supposed to start in 2020, right? And so that means that China has all these years to continue doing what it's doing, and we see that this is what's happening.
Okay. First of all, the global climate is extremely difficult to deal with. You cannot just pass a bill and the day later we reduce everything. There are cars, there are airplanes, there are buses, there are trucks. There's a lot of things to factor in. So we think 4 years from now is not that bad to start a climate change deal. But second of all, China hasn't just decided to contribute. It's been 80% of its energy commissions have been coming off of solar energy. Yes, coal has been a factor, but China has been contributing, and we think that's a good thing. So let's go to the first clash point. Is the rise of China beneficial for the economy? We've given you a lot of logical layers of analysis about why it's good for the economy that we have simply not heard an answer for. The first argument was that before the rise of China, the average income was 4,000. After the rise, it's 9,000. No response. We've also said that 45 million people died before the rise of China. After the rise, 680 million were brought out of poverty. No response. Finally, we've given you the idea that the US has actually recognized China along with the EU as being an advanced economy and actually dealt with more deals and trades with them because they have recognized them after the rise. No response. The one response we have gotten is non-unique. I'm sorry, but the 680 million people that have been got out of absolute poverty, it's not non-unique to them, it's actually very unique for them. Their lives have been saved, their economies have been better, and we think that's a good thing. Also, this answers all their human rights abuse claims. They say human rights abuse is happening. We're saying a better economy leads to better human rights, but we have to have a better economy first.
Sir.
No, thank you. Now, onto the point about Beijing. First of all, Beijing, they said it had slave labor to create the actual buildings. We agree, it was not perfect, but Beijing was the first time in which China allowed actual protests to happen without saying, hey, we're going to kill you because you disagree with our political beliefs. Second of all, China actually invested in saving 500 children and launching 45,000 police forces to save those children within the Beijing protests. And third of all, the reason China was even allowed to have the Beijing Olympics is because of the rise of China. We agree, it's not going to be perfect, but it will be comparatively better. Now, the second point was, can the rise of China make the world more global? I want to go about the African countries analysis here. We said that in Kenya, 2 million people have got energy because China has invested within Kenyan resources. They say the aid is conditional. They have not provided a warrant for this argument. We have said that the aid is unconditional. China has not asked anything to give this aid.
On that point.
Second of all, we also think that it has helped other countries like Nigeria, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. They say these are all countries of human rights abuses, and we agree. But there are still people in those countries that have benefited from the rise of China. Yes, human rights abuses are happening. We are not a perfect world. We understand that. But comparatively, it is still better to have the rise of China to help those people. Also, we think this links into our multipolarity point, that the reason China is able to help other nations like Nigeria and make them the third largest advanced economy in the world is because it's multipolar. Because it's not the United States or Europe just budging into other nations, because developing nations like China that have now become developed or starting to become developed are actually going into other nations and beginning to help them. We have not heard a response from this. Our third point, does China have more social benefits? Look, this is a reason to vote for us independently. We have seen feminism in China. We have seen the abolishment of the one-child policy. We have seen that in 1982, they rewrote their own constitution because they understood the mistakes that were in the constitution before the rise of China. We have seen that the raping and inspecting of women for their virginity has stopped because China agrees that it's a bad thing. We have seen the ethnic minorities who were killed because they didn't attribute to the Communist Party has stopped. Artistic communication has happened. All of these things are good things and beneficial things to the global economy, to the global benefits of China, and to the people, the lives of the people in China that have been helped. We have not heard a response from them. Their next speech is going to be the human rights abuse. We understand, we're not perfect. But if all these major benefits can happen, comparatively, the rise of feminism, the rise of rewriting the Constitution, it's a good thing. At the end of the round, you have to ask yourself a question. Do you want the rise of China, or do you want the before the rise of China? We've given reasons why the rise is good, they have not given reasons why the rise is bad.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I come to my rebuttal, let me remind you what side opposition stands for. Firstly, we want to guarantee stability and security in East Asia, the world, and by doing so, secure the freedom of the individual. We want to protect our environment, and we want to look out for developing countries, as for example, Africa. We see that the rise of China in the political, military, and economic aspect does the exactly opposite. Okay, so here we have three major arguments, and now I will deal with them one by one and tell you why they fall. Firstly, we have the clash of economics, right? So they said, oh, it's so good that we have now this economic development, and this is obviously beneficial. But we need to point out several things. Firstly, the whole first speech was based on the economic development in China, the whole time about China, okay? And then they said, yeah, well, you know what? So many people are not poor anymore, and so many people have more money. Yes, we agree. However, what we're saying is that it is the fact that the digital divide has widened since the rise of China, meaning that the lower class has less money and is now facing more poverty and more hunger. No, thank you. Then there's this whole point about what the economic power is actually based on. So they're saying, the third speaker said, well, we can get better politics basically when we have a better economy. However, we're saying that the economy of China is so good because of the misuse that they have on human rights. Why? Because it is a fact that the economic sector of China is basically based on the exploitation of raw materials, which is everything that our second speaker has mentioned, right? Yeah. No, thank you. It is based on this because it's what it does. It exploits the resources in the developing world. And then they said, oh, well, you know what? It's actually helping so many other countries, like countries in Africa, like Sudan and Angola. But what they're missing to see is that they're doing it because of the self-centered reasons. They're doing it only because they get a benefit. And that's why the aid is unconditional. Yes, please.
We're fine with them doing it for self-centered reasons, as long as it gets millions of people out of poverty, which is what it has done.
Okay, thank you. Well, then you see that the aid is not unconditional. They're only doing it so that they can have this. And what we're not okay with is that by doing so, they're having this cheap labor. They are exploiting their resources. They're doing all this, which is a violation of the human rights. Firstly, when they're talking about how it's so idealistic and it's so good for all these people, you see that it's actually doing the complete opposite. Yeah. And secondly, no thank you. They said that it's good on the economic level because it's getting them out of poverty, but what they're failing to see is that they're not helping these countries at all. Again, everything that our second speaker already pointed out. Why? Because they can't do this if they by doing so are having no domestic growth in these countries in Africa, because the raw materials that they get from there are all sent back to China, 90%, and the people that they're having work there are Chinese high-skilled workers. So again, you're not really helping these African countries that you're saying are so good. So therefore, the people are not getting out of poverty. And secondly, these products are then sold, it's the Chinese product, the end product that is sold on the African market, which therefore prohibits domestic growth and therefore does not end poverty in Africa or in these countries. Not only that, but now to this human rights thing. Since they have this right and they're becoming the superpower, what they have is an autocratic government.
Yeah.
This means that they have an oppressive system, a system that does not respect the human rights. And by doing so, by having so much rights, they influence their partners in these countries, for example, Sudan and Angola, to do the same, which is what is happening at the moment. So therefore, you're not helping on an economic level, nor on a human rights level. Okay, now let's move to the aspect of of how it's good to have more than one
Point of
superpower.
information.
No, thank you. What they're failing to see is that by having more than one superpower, it's going to be very difficult to reach a consensus on the international level and therefore create more conflicts. We see that tensions between China and the USA, which are now the two most influential, would be raised. And if both are raised, then we have more tension. This means that it's going to lead to more conflicts, right? And if we have two now that are super strong, it's even worse, because if the two strongest powers have conflicts against themselves, it's going to destabilize the whole world, not only on that level. No, thank you. And we see this, for example, with how China wants to access all the mineral resources in South China Sea and the East China Sea. So what they want to do is exploit these resources because it's obviously beneficial to their economy. And the USA wants to do the complete opposite. Why? Because of its allies in East Asia. The USA thinks, therefore, that China's methods are too aggressive, and they do this because it is so, these countries are of so much importance on the military aspect to the USA strategically, and as well as the economic. For example, Philippines, Japan are very strong trading partners, so then they go against China. Then they have two completely opposite views, which increase tensions, and therefore do not secure stabilization in the world. Something that they failed to point out through all three of their speeches was the military aspect. And as their first speaker said, and didn't get absolutely any rebuttal, was how they have this, China's missile test, how they have the gunboat policy. We would love to hear a reply on how this is good for human rights and how they are actually helping people. Yes, please.
Militaristic aggression over the South China Sea is going to exist whether or not there is a rise in China. That point is not
Thank you. Okay. Now, this is why this kind of reason is fallacious. Firstly, yes, it increases. But if we give China more power, do you really think that it's not going to take even more advantage of all its military? The rise of China means that you have a military rise. You have more military power. And if you have more military power, are you really going to stand there and say, oh yeah, but they're going to use it in super well ways, like they haven't up to now, but they now are going to be super good and use it in only good ways? No, ladies and gentlemen, this is just naive, okay? Then we have this whole point on the environment. So we all know that China's major energy source is fossil fuels, and we're not going to stand here and say, well, they have absolutely no solar panels and no wind power. We see that they do. However, we see that the numbers in CO2 emissions have actually risen over the years. As China's rise has gotten stronger, so has its negative impact on the environment. The CO2 emissions this year have been much worse than the USA's and Europe's combined. Why? Because China doesn't have this high standards on motorization. And now more and more motorization is increasing where the engines of the cars don't have to meet these standards. And this causes obviously more pollution, more smog, and then therefore respiratory diseases, right? And this is everything our first speaker already talked about in the example of Beijing, how this year they had that red alarm. As China's rise continues to get better and continues to get stronger, so how do you want to say that it's actually not bad for the environment? And ladies and gentlemen, for all these reasons, because it has a negative military aspect, because it's not really helping economic growth in these other countries, and it's actually not beneficial for the poorest class in China, which is the majority, because it widens the digital divide and is also not good in a human rights level, since it influences other countries such as Sudan and Angola to do the same and apply their model, which they have done. We are proud to oppose.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Today we have got two teams with two different case philosophies. On the one hand, we have a team which thinks that disrespecting human rights, disrespecting the environment, which is theoretically and indirectly disrespecting human rights to live and not to suffer, and thinking that helping African countries without not even helping them is good. On the other hand, we have a side opposition, which is for control, which is for human rights, for what we stand for what we fought many years. We have a UN Charter which declares this. We also have the side of being just human, for being nice to humanity. We had two big clashes today. First of all, we had the clash that when people starve, is it good that we develop, and when we develop, of course it's good when we develop, but still we're disrespecting human rights, as I pointed out, as she pointed out, and I pointed out many various times. Is it have got better? Are we that capitalist to think that economic growth is better than human rights? Secondly, we have the aspect of the rise of Africa and sustainability. They think that the rise in Africa has been good, which is absolutely utopic, because we have proven to you that the rise of Africa has done the exact opposite thing. It has been selfish from China to be there. It legitimizes an autocratic system which oppresses, as I pointed out, human rights. It destroys the local market. It floods it. It is completely unsustainable. Then, so we have to decide. At the end of the day, we have to decide between two teams. First of all, a team which is that capitalist to think that lives are not worth money, and another team which thinks that being human is good and supports everything what we stand for and we fought a long time for. Therefore, I've made my choice. I'm going to team opposition. Thank you.
Starvation on the count of millions. Communist Maoist oppression on the account of hundreds of millions. No foreign aid at all. No escape for people without power in Kenya. No rise of Nigeria. US hegemony continues. China continues burning dirty coal without any effort to increase alternative energy. In answer to all of this stuff that China was doing before the rise, they say, do nothing. That is their advocacy, because they've not given you any convincing way in which China could have ameliorated those concerns. They simply say that the amelioration of them did more harm than good, which is simply a ridiculous case strategy if you want to win this round. We say China's rise, in which 45 million people did not die, and 680 million people were given work, is a rise up that was incredibly powerful and a good for the world. Let's analyze that from two different points of view. First of all, from the economic, and second, from the socio-political. So on the economic, let's talk about within China first. We give you a lot of reasons why, within China, the rise of China has caused a comparative benefit to the people of China. Again, on the order of the hundreds of millions. We've told you how the ability to own property, liberal economic policy, the death of Maoism, and stable economic growth has created an environment in which 608 million people can put food on the table for their families, plus more, that we have a rising middle class, and that is something that could never have happened without the rise of China that existed. Meanwhile, in answer, they only give you reasons why China is bad now. It's an important distinction to make. Arguing China is bad now is not enough for them to win the debate. They must argue China is worse than it was before. They have not done that. Therefore, the rise of China into economic growth has been one that has been positive. The only real answer to this is that they say, like, economy is second to human rights because human rights are more important. That's an incredibly privileged stance to take. The economy is key to everybody's human rights because without money, you can't put food on the table. For the 680 million people, again, who have jobs now, that's certainly a human right to put food on the table for their families. That is outweighing all of the human rights that they talk about. It is basic to put food on the table. It is not to have China oppressing the Senkaku Islands, even though I've told you that they don't really do anything to do that. Outside China, we told you that the aid is unconditional, yes, which means that China acts as a lender, but they don't put conditions upon the aid, which is fine. That any human rights abuses that occur are not the fault of China, because again, they give the aid to like corporations and businesses to rise. That there are non-oppressive regimes that they help, and that millions and millions of people have escaped from poverty in places like Nigeria because of the aid that Africa gives, and millions of people have escaped from powerlessness in Kenya because of that same aid. We think that on the economic level, millions of people are helped that they don't account for. The second argument is about social and political growth. We talked to you about how, like, the one-child policy was repealed, how corruption is going down, there's a crackdown on it, how death camps are going away, how there's no more work camps, how increases in feminism have happened, that they're no longer killing the classes of landlords by the hundreds of thousands, that there's no longer government-sanctioned rape that's happening in China. In answer, they say, oh, well, economic growth is based on human rights abuses. Okay, like we understand that there are bad things happening in China. We understand that there's some forms of wage slavery happening in China. But that is getting better and better by the day, including CO2 emissions, by the way, because of their alternative energy programs. None of the stuff that they said outweighs the fact that for millions of people, they allow their families to live because of the rise of China. That's why we propose. Thank you.